In this episode, you'll hear some sensitive topics. So with this trigger warning, if you have little ones around, please grab your headphones now.
In April of 2011, one of those startups that became a unicorn and had been supercharging my life in many ways for the previous 4 years. It came crashing down in a very, very public way under indictment from the Department of Justice, class action lawsuits from millions of customers. And my entire life seemed to be imploding in slow motion from the period of April of 2011 to the end of 2012. And try as I might to fight and struggle, I wasn't going to make a hill of beans a difference, and the company couldn't be saved. And that meant really bad things for me and my family and friends and investors and customers. And I was effectively having an emotional nervous breakdown over time. And I woke up January 1, 2012 in a psychotic state, full-blown psychosis.
Wow.
And there's a lot to the story of, well, what I'll say now is that my wife saved me by helping me get from Mexico, where we were vacationing, back home to LA to be in the care of my family and what they knew how to do to stabilize me, which was put me in a psychiatric care.
Wow.
And that's one side of what happened.
Yeah.
There's another side of what happened for me internally. It was an awakening. So I'm holding both truths as true simultaneously. I was in a psychotic state, my body and mind, and I was having an awakening, a spiritual awakening. And I was seeing beyond the veil, experiencing beyond the veil. And I was caught between these two worlds.
Folks, this week's guest is my new friend, Rafe Furst, an accomplished entrepreneur, tech investor, and world champion poker player. Talk about twists and turns, surviving roller coasters of ups and downs to realize that you are a spiritual being having a human experience. You'll definitely want to tune in to hear Rafe's evolution. Let's cue the intro. Welcome to the Boom Vision Podcast, the show that empowers you to live an enriching life physically, mentally, and spiritually. I am your host, Benjamin Ye, and I created this podcast to give you perspectives on how to strengthen your mindset so that you can build optimal health, create aligned wealth, and connect with your higher self. It's all interconnected. Let's get to work. Hi, folks. Welcome back to episode 61 of the Boom Vision Podcast. I'm ecstatic to invite Rafe Furst to our show today. Rafe is a new friend that was introduced through our mutual friend, Tian Mu, a couple months ago, and I couldn't have been more excited to share Rafe's story with y'all today. As a brief background, Rafe Furst is an accomplished entrepreneur, tech investor, and world champion poker player, renowned for his victory at the 2006 World Series of Poker Championship Bracelet in Pot Limit Hold'em. Beyond his poker prowess, Furst is a thought leader in the realms of early-stage finance and cryptocurrency, having shared his insights through various articles, interviews, and presentations like TEDx. His visionary ideas encompass technology and investing, and they have garnered attention in publications such as Wired, the New York Times Magazine, and the Freakonomics blog. Furst's personal mission is to facilitate individuals in overcoming obstacles and finding solutions in their lives, a process he initiates by empathetic listening and offering practical guidance. He has worked with a diverse range of individuals from high net worth to those facing financial challenges, executives, entrepreneurs, creative professionals, and more, consistently delivering positive outcomes for those willing to embark on a deep exploration of their personal journey with him. So without further ado, here's Rafe. Rafe Furst, welcome to the Boom Vision podcast. Thanks for joining us today, man.
Thank you, Ben. It's a pleasure to be here.
I have been looking forward to today, and I'm so glad we're just starting it today. Rafe, why don't we get started? I would love to hear your origin story. Can you tell us where did it start for you? And what was like the series of events that led to where you are today?
Wow. Well, so I grew up mostly in Southern California on the beaches, Venice Beach. I was born in 1968, so I was in Venice in the 70s and early 80s, and like many people of my generation, born to progressive, hippie or hippie adjacent parents, intellectuals. I was a latchkey kid, so spent a lot of time kind of doing my own thing and getting in trouble with friends, not too much trouble. And early on, I was always attracted to games and gambling, financial games. I was attracted to the stock market. I started playing gin rummy and horse races with my grandfather on the one side and stock markets and on the other side. And early on as well, I guess when I was maybe 12 years old in junior high school, I got introduced to computer programming, Apple II Plus, precursor to the Mac and Mac. And I would say that was like my first passion and love was programming computers. I love the ability to specify commands and control and get the output that I wanted. Maybe that was a way to contrast with the relative lack of control and chaos in my environment growing up. But I
Hmm.
loved it. I was good academically, like really good academically, but that didn't come out in the public schools that I went to before junior high school. And then I went to a small private school in Los Angeles called Windward School. And I just really blossomed academically, interested in just about everything. Really, the relationships with my teachers, we were on a first name basis as opposed to Mr. and Mrs. It was just a very like welcoming and small community that helped me become who I am. And so, yeah, I continued to program through high school and then got into Stanford University. I was really interested in studying computer science and artificial intelligence.
Hmm.
And at the time, this is, 40 years ago now, almost 40 years ago now, AI was nothing like it is today in terms of its in the world. Like we talked about this idea of creating an artificial general intelligence, right? A machine that could think and have consciousness and agency like humans. And it was a real science fiction at the time based on the state of the art. And so in my academic journey there, I went through a period of like disillusionment. What I came there to study in artificial intelligence and creating a artificial consciousness brain, it didn't seem like they were doing anything remotely like that. It was just on the wrong path. So, after college and I went to grad school, I master's degree there as well, and in artificial intelligence. And I went into research really because I wanted to do something more entrepreneurial, but there was nothing really going on in the early 90s in Silicon Valley. The web hadn't come along yet. In fact, part of my origin story for how I became an early web entrepreneur is that one of my fellow grad students showed me something called the Mosaic web browser, which is the very first browser for the internet. And I just had this epiphany. What I was seeing on the screen was blowing my mind. And I thought, well, this is going to change the world. And I want to be a part of it. But it took several years for me to realize that I wasn't going to do that from the research institute, but I need to go branch off and start something or join something. And so around 1994 or 5, I called together a group of friends who were technically minded and entrepreneurially minded, including friends that I've been playing poker with in a poker game that we started in college that still exists to this day, actually. So people who are risk takers, presumably intelligent risk takers. And we started, it was maybe 15 of us, and we started coming up with ideas for what to do with this web browser, this web technology. And we came up with so many different ideas that sounded awesome and that eventually turned into companies, successful companies that we didn't do. But we weren't ready to jump in and out of our day jobs, any of us, on any of those. And turned out that the folks that were willing, it turned out to be 3 of us, we had a requirement. We had to be able to bootstrap the company ourselves and not take money from venture capitalists. And we had to focus on what we were good at, which is creating technology. So we realized that we needed to build a technology, prove the concept that it's valuable, and get acquired by another entity, another company, so that it could actually be successful and valuable in the world.
Thanks for sharing that, Rafe. A couple of the keywords that caught my attention was one, it felt like, early on, because I got to know you in the last couple of months, is you're able to kind of detect trends before it becomes a trend,
Yes.
which is interesting because if you think, you're talking about AI 40 years ago when like it's really came on the scene arguably in the last less than even 4 years ago, right? And so I find that interesting because I see that as a repeat pattern in your life. But the other thing too is that, you talk about the love of playing games. And whether we talk about it now or later, I love to just understand kind of what did you find in throughout your life, your association and relationship with this word game?
Yeah.
Because, from a broader things of if we zoom out, it's like, well, everyone's playing a game of life,
Yeah.
right? And so how you approach the situation is really the mindset of how you play it. And so there's a lot more nuances to that in terms of the businesses you got involved in, experiences that you had in life. And so just when you hear the word game, what does that mean to you?
Yeah. Well, first of all, fun
Hmm.
and a safe way to have fun. I think what I resonate with in terms of games is that there's a structure and rules and an order to it. It's not just completely free form. And the best games or the most interesting games have this balance between open-endedness and a structure and an order and strategies that help you win or progress in the game.
Yeah,
And that could be, they don't have to be games that, that are competitive.
right.
It could be cooperative games. And I've learned they don't have to be games that are finite, that have an end.
Hmm.
Life could be thought of as an infinite game, and there are books and such written about that. But I like games as a metaphor for life. Everything that I've done professionally to me has been either directly and overtly games, like the web company that I was referring to.
Yeah.
It was called Pick'em Sports, and it combined my love of predicting outcomes, sporting events with gamified structure. A lot at that time, there wasn't such a category as fantasy sports, but
Oh,
we
interesting.
were doing early fantasy sports.
Yeah. And was that created with the intention of like, using fantasy sports as an analogy, a way for people to create their own home games of just like that? Or was there monetary compensation involved in that game
Mhm.
structure?
Yeah,
Or yeah, I'm just curious.
yeah, good questions. For context, there were people did their own office pools or home like
Right.
March Madness where
Yeah.
predicting the football pools and whatnot.
Yeah.
And yeah, when people were doing it privately, there was always some kind of money at stake or prizes, right?
Right. Right.
But the laws were such that it wasn't legal to actually do that at that time and do that online. And so
Mm.
what we did is we created contests with those same game mechanics, it costs nothing to enter.
Got it.
There's no entry.
Yeah.
And there'd be prizes put up by sponsors. And so we sold these as promotional content
Mm.
for early websites for media companies like Yahoo and
Oh,
various
interesting.
different media brands.
Yeah.
Newspapers and television stations were all just getting their feet wet with their own websites and web presence. And they needed to attract users.
Right.
They needed to learn about their users, so get registration information. They needed what was called at the time stickiness. They needed to keep people on the site because they were selling advertising. And so we provided a solution in the form of these games that we just love playing and with our friends, bringing the offline onto the online
Got
and
it.
making technology around, hey, anybody could create any kind of sports contest they want easily with a WYSIWYG editor and have their own private or white label contest for fun.
So, Rafe, with Pick'em Sports, what was the life cycle of that company with your co-founders, and what was the biggest takeaway you learned from that experience?
So I want to say we launched towards the beginning of 1997, and we built it ourselves, the three of us, for 2 years before deciding it was time to find an acquirer. And we were really hoping that Yahoo or CBS Sportsline, which were two of our client companies, one of them would buy it.
Mm-hmm.
But as it turns out, we were more attractive to a conglomerate that was coming together around fantasy sports. So there were other small companies around the country and in Canada that were doing similar in different parts of this fantasy sports
Mm.
online puzzle or ecosystem. And so a financier out of Toronto identified all these companies that had synergies like ours and put us together. There may be 5 different companies.
Sounds like it
And
was a aggregator that kind
an
of,
aggregate.
yeah,
Yeah,
got it.
that's right. A roll up.
Yep.
So in finance terms. And they used a vehicle called a reverse public merger.
Mm.
They found a company which was a shell company that was listed on the OTC markets that was a vehicle for us to put the 5 different companies together into the one conglomerate and be a publicly traded company, provide liquidity for the founders and investors, also allow individual investors who just liked our games to
Yeah.
be able to invest in the company. I mean, for context, at the time, that was the goal of every single startup, was to eventually go public.
Mm.
These days, not so much.
Right, right. That was the tech boom and bust, right? Back in the
Yeah,
late 90s. But
yeah,
interesting. So that was like your first exit. Is that right?
yeah. That was our first exit, and it was unbelievable. Like,
Interesting.
things never go according to plan, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you start something, and we didn't know, so we didn't know how
Mm.
lucky or fortunate we were to be able to say, hey, we're going to start a company, and within a year we're going to exit, we're going to sell it, and it took 2 years, and we were like, well, this took a lot longer. We had no idea how lucky we got and fortunate we were, but we did, and then so that's like 1999. A year later, in March of 2000, the web bubble burst, and all the money and interest that was flying into the space from all corners of the globe, markets crashed and whatnot. And by the end of the year 2000, we closed the doors and filed for bankruptcy.
Mm.
And so we got the full boom and bust cycle. And it was an incredible, incredible achievement, and also an incredible failure and learning experience, not only because it was a failure as a company, but in the transition between private company to part of this conglomerate, we offered the opportunity for our friends and family to invest, and they lost all their money.
Mm.
And that's a huge mistake. And I'll say, not one that I didn't repeat. Like, I
Mm.
repeated that same mistake multiple times, 3, 4 more times
Hmm.
in the course of my career. I was not yet ready to wake up to what I was doing, the pattern that I was facilitating and being a part of and
Yeah.
attracting.
Yeah.
And nor was I even close to ready to own my part of it and wanting to change.
Interesting. So I'm curious. So after that first startup experience, what pivoted to the next chapter? What did that springboard you into?
Yeah, totally. So I was still in my extended adolescence and having a lot of fun. So here I am at 30, 31 years old, and I have $1 million in cash in my pocket. And I'm single, and I don't have any obligations anymore to work or anything else. And I took the opportunity to just live and have fun and play games. And so it started as a commitment to myself. Let's say the beginning, January of 2001, I wanted to travel. I wanted to go reconnect with friends and family that I, as a startup entrepreneur, just neglected. And I wanted to play the professional poker circuit. And for context, in junior high, I learned how to play poker, and I've been playing poker, as a very avid hobby ever since. In Silicon Valley, where I was, and the game that I had helped start at Stanford, but also more generally, there was a community of, what Usenet bulletin boards were, the like before Reddit.
Yeah. Yeah.
There were these peer-to-peer distributed news groups
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
for any kind of focus area you wanted. So there's
Mm-hmm.
one called rec.gambling.poker.
Hmm.
And I and my friends were part of that. It's basically technical, mathematical geeks who love poker and wanted to learn and play with each other from a game theory optimal perspective.
Nice. Sounds like something
And
I'll probably enjoy.
yeah, totally, totally. And these were the precursors to the online poker sites.
Got it. Yeah, because like if I remember correctly, World Series of Poker and a televised circuit, it didn't really come on the scene until I want to say it was like the mid 2000s, right?
So 2003 when Chris Moneymaker
Yeah,
won the World Series as an
that's
amateur,
right. That's right.
and he had an incredible last name. He had an
Right.
incredible story,
Right.
and he won his $10,000 seat into the championship event, the main event of the World Series, playing online at Poker Stars.
Hmm.
And this was also the confluence of televised. They just figured out, they cracked the code on how to make poker exciting on
Hmm.
television with
Right.
whole cart cameras and
Right.
really good editing.
Yeah.
And so the confluence of various factors, that's when it exploded. So I started getting into playing at the World Series at the year 2001. So as part of this journey of never-ending fun and adolescence, I traveled for most of that time with my best friend Phil Gordon, who was a fellow artificial intelligence researcher when I met him, playing poker in the card rooms and and on the chat forums in the mid 90s in
Hmm.
Silicon Valley. And he had a cash out from his startup a year earlier. And so we were both footloose and fancy free, had more cash than wisdom and a love for fun and playing poker and travel. And so we combined forces. And that first year in 2001, we both played the main event of the World Series of Poker, $10,000 buy-in for the first time ourselves. And we both made it pretty far. Phil ended up fourth in the final table
Wow.
and burst onto the scene as a budding celebrity in this world
Yeah.
of high stakes poker and televised poker. And that supercharged, that fueled the adventure. And so, just in broad strokes, we were on the road for 3 years, 2001, 2002, 2003. We had decided that we were going to take the entire year, starting the Super Bowl 2003 and go on the road in an RV, trailering his Porsche, and do a year-long sports road trip. We called it the ultimate sports adventure. Two guys in a monster RV on the greatest road trip in sports history.
Dude, that sounds like a perfect like reality TV on the Travel Channel.
Uh, yeah, there were actually some film crews that wanted to come along and turn it into a reality TV, but
Right.
we declined.
Okay. Good for you. Good for you.
Yeah,
That would have ruined, I think, the experience of what. Okay, but anyways,
that's what
we
we
get
thought.
sidetracked.
That's exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and actually, you can see Ben in the background. My trophy, so to speak, for that is that we ended up in the Sports Illustrated Road Trip Hall of Fame,
Hmm.
which was a sponsored content by McDonald's thing they made up because they heard our story and what are you going to do with it?
Yeah.
Uh, they put it in sponsored content, but nonetheless, Sports Road Trip Hall of Fame and we spent a year on the road, Super Bowl to Super Bowl, every major event in sports.
Oh wow.
I mean, certainly every guy's wildest dream, and a lot of women, were envious of that as well. But we just had a fantastic time.
Yeah. So, okay, I'm curious.
Yeah.
From that sort of once in a lifetime experience, because you're just living your joy, right? For a full year with your
Mm-hmm.
best bud going
Mm-hmm.
across country.
Yes.
And I'm sure there's countless stories, but where I want to direct the attention to, I'm curious, is that knowing and experiencing what you went through in that 1 year, what's one thing you found out about yourself that you couldn't have known if you have not gone on that trip?
Well, I'm sure there are many, but one came instantly to me. So several months before we embarked on that trip in November of 2002, I was traveling in South America by myself, and I met my future wife on a park bench in Santiago, Chile. And it's incredibly magical story, which we could go into if you want. But in the context of your question, I thought that I was going to be completely romantically unattached, carefree for this ultimate guy's road trip for the entire year. But by halfway through, like I was really in heartache
Oh,
because I figured it out that we were meant to be together really early on before she
yeah,
did.
yeah.
And certainly it was getting in the way. Like pursuing that would get in the way
Hmm.
of our ultimate sports adventure.
Yeah.
And so that was a reconciliation of the heart that happened only after the road trip. But by the time, we were halfway through the trip, I was 100% certain that the very next thing I would do is I would go to New York to find Laura and make it happen.
Dude, Rafe, I felt that, man. There's nothing more amazing than to get clarity. And it sounds and feels like that was one of the big gifts of going on a trip to know that. Because otherwise you wouldn't have known that. And man, I felt that, dude.
100%. And have you watched this reality series called Alone, where people go out into the wilderness or dropped out into the wilderness to see how
Mm-mm,
long they can last?
mm-mm.
So the setup's not important, but what I'm pointing to is that on these journeys of aloneness, the biggest learning that they have is to be thankful for what they have back at home.
Yeah,
And so when they
yeah.
eventually tap out, because they all eventually tap out except for one, it's not because they can't survive physically. Usually,
Mm,
sometimes it is,
mm.
but just spiritually and emotionally,
Yeah,
they're done. They want to go home. They miss their family. They realize they've been taking for granted everything that they've had, and so
yeah,
that's similar to what you're pointing to in my realization on that trip
yeah,
is. And you're right. Was it not for the way we met and the trip that was an obstacle and a challenge and a really enticing one at that,
yeah.
seductive one at that, was I not presented with that obstacle to my future, I wouldn't have actually risen to the challenge. I would have let it go by.
In hindsight, I mean, hindsight is always 2020, but in hindsight, it just feels like that realization and that trip helped build another layer of foundation between you and Laura that might not have been there if you had not gone on that trip.
No question. No question. And
Beautiful.
even with that, we
Hmm.
were long distance for a year and a half, West Coast, East Coast. And that's a really
Wow.
good way to get clarity.
Yeah.
It's a make or break. You're forced to
Yeah.
do work between you that otherwise you wouldn't, right? At
That's
least in
right.
our case. And so that was a gift as well.
Yeah. So, Rafe, you
Please.
mentioned the S word, spirituality, which I love.
Oh, gosh.
Since you mentioned just now, I want to take a slight detour on that path. I love to know in your life what either event, defining event, or a series of events that acted as a tipping point for you in awakening your own spiritual journey.
It's been a long series of events.
Mm,
Still, and it's still happening.
yeah,
And I'll give you some waypoints on the
some
journey.
highlights. Beautiful. Okay.
So starting during that 3 year period when I was traveling and carefree and coming off of Silicon Valley, where hyper rational, reductionist worldview, and then in this subculture of poker, which was game theory optimal, and it's about, there's no such thing as luck. Luck is just a artifact. It's all probabilities, and there's no guiding forces, nothing beyond the material realm
Hmm.
in the rationalist worldview,
Okay. Did
which
you
is the
believe
default,
that?
which is the default worldview.
Got it.
To believe it. Well, that's the question.
Yeah.
So I was very good at playing that game,
Hmm.
the rationalist game. And I've learned that when you're very good at something and people look up to you for your skills in it, you start to identify as that and
Hmm.
start to think of yourself as that. Now, I think I've always understood at some level that there's more than meets the eye or can be measured or thought about or talked about. But it's been a long, long journey to unwind those worldview structures and, yeah, organizing thoughts and patterns of behavior that kept me in that matrix. And so what I'll say is that there was a loosening of that. I started playing a game with myself when I traveled. I said, hey, I'm going to act as if life is more coincidental and magical and lucky and miraculous than my mind tells me it is. I'm going to suspend my disbelief in luck and miracles and manifestation. And I'm going to start to notice coincidences and not try to rationalize them away.
Hmm.
And so, one example is I was in Brazil on the beach in Rio. I'm a big beach volleyball player too. I love playing beach volleyball. And so Phil and I were in Africa, in South Africa, on the beach in Cape Town, playing volleyball a year earlier. And we had met some German pro beach volleyball players and started playing with them. And it was, I was great. And we spent a couple of weeks, playing with them. Didn't keep in touch. And then, like a year later, in the beach in Rio, I look and 100 yards away, I see a form, a figure. And I was like, Maria? It's like, that's one of the women. And I called out to her and she's just astonished. But I was in my mode of like, yes, is meant to be. And it's like, oh, so I just said, hey, there you are. I've been looking for you. Let's play. And so that's one example of where I put that suspension of disbelief and intention to
Hmm.
lean into that spiritual world into action in my life.
Yeah.
And then the other, of course, was several weeks later meeting Laura on a park bench
Hmm.
and being
Woo.
open to the possibility that she is the one and that we were meant to be and that we'd known
Man,
each other before in previous lifetimes.
I just got the body chills, dude. I feel like that one simple act of suspending your disbelief, and I think you'll chuckle when I say this, momentarily believing a scene rather than the other way around.
Mm-hmm.
I think that sparked a chain of events where it might have led you to be on that bench in that park and seeing Laura.
Yeah, I agree with that now. I wouldn't have then. And
Yeah.
I love your expression, believing is seeing.
Yeah.
It aligns with the neuroscience that I've learned since.
Mm,
So I don't say that I don't choose between rationalist and spiritual. I say
yeah.
that I'm trans rationalist because I still have all those faculties of logic and reasoning and
Yeah.
scientific process and all that. They just don't lead my life in the same way, and they're not the only thing. In fact,
Got it.
they're secondary to this idea that I'm a spiritual being having a
Yeah.
human experience.
Lovely. Okay. So I felt like the story you shared of the volleyball story is like an appetizer. I still feel there's like the main entree
Yeah,
you
there's
haven't
more.
shared. So if you can share what's the main entree event that became a tipping point for the spirituality, I love to hear that because I know there's a series of different ones, but if you use your intuition on what happened either right after or what's the one major event, what would that be and why?
Yeah, the next major event happened almost 10 years later.
Oh, okay. So this would have been what? This would have been 2013?
So January 1, 2012. So Laura and I are married and living together in Los Angeles. I was on so two more startups sort of in the can and ups and downs. And we can go into what those were, but for the purposes of this, in April of 2011, one of those startups that became a unicorn and had been supercharging my life in many ways for the previous 4 years. It came crashing down in a very, very public way
Mm,
under indictment from the Department of Justice, class action lawsuits from millions of customers. And my entire life seemed to be imploding in slow motion from the period of April of 2011 to the end of 2012.
mm,
And try as I might to fight and struggle, it was not, I wasn't going to make a hill of beans a difference, and the company couldn't be saved. And that meant really bad things for me and my family and friends and investors and customers. And I was effectively having an emotional nervous breakdown over time. And I woke up January 1, 2012 in a psychotic state, full blown psychosis.
wow.
And there's a lot to the story of, well, what I'll say now is that my wife saved me
Mm,
by helping me get from Mexico, where we were vacationing, back home to LA to be in the care of my family and what they knew how to do to stabilize me, which was put me in a psychiatric care.
wow.
And that's one side of what happened.
Yeah.
There's another side of what happened for me internally was it was an awakening. So I'm holding both truths as true simultaneously. I was in a psychotic state, my body and mind, and I was having an awakening, a spiritual awakening. And
Mm,
I was seeing beyond the veil,
mhm.
experiencing beyond the veil. And I was caught between these two worlds. And just for and there's a lot of ways we can go here,
Yeah.
and I'm
Yeah.
to any of it.
Yeah.
I've written publicly about this, and
Mm,
people want to learn more and have a more coherent timeline and narrative about what was going on. They can
yeah.
go to my website and read about it. So
Okay. Got it.
yeah,
Well, first of all, I just want to acknowledge, thank you, Ray, for sharing so unfiltered and raw about that experience. I can only imagine how something like that can impact just mentally your nervous system, everything. And so I just want to first acknowledge that, and I appreciate you sharing that. And I think you're right. There's a lot of different ways we can go with that event. And I can't help but remember, when we hung out the other week, you said something that I made a mental note saying, "Oh, this will be good for an interview," which was the means justify the ends.
Yep.
Do the means justify the ends, and it depends on what paradigm you live in, right? And I'm curious, with that sentence, do you feel part of the contributing factors to that point where things were crashing down? Do you think part of it was living that statement, or the opposite, or you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
because I
Mhm.
feel there's a little bit of a
There's a
connection.
huge connection.
Yeah, okay. So
Yeah.
tell me more. What does that statement mean to you, and how did that contribute, and all the above?
Yeah. Well, first I'll say that that experience, the psychotic break part, wasn't the completeness of an awakening. It was the very, very beginning of cracking open
Mm,
my psyche and my ego, which was very, very strong
mm,
and had a ironclad grip on my view of the world and my morality and my values and my the way I treated people, full stop, the way I treated myself, full stop, everything. The
got it.
matrix,
Yeah,
my personal matrix.
yeah.
So it was a red pill of sorts, but I only got half the red pill. Like I said, I was in caught between worlds. And so it was more of a traumatic awakening and in need of healing, along with all the wounds that created that matrix and ego structure along the way
Mm,
growing up.
mm,
And so a couple of years later, I was introduced to a woman named Ronit Hertzfeld, who is a real incredible trauma therapist, amongst other things, but has had decades of experience in, I would say, integral or integrative therapy. And she had started recently with a small cohort, small community, a new kind of personal group development container called Leap Forward. And yeah, I was, a part of that like initial group where Ronit was teaching us how she knew what she knew about personal growth and
mm.
awakening. And we were doing so in an experimental container, which is a group setting. Yeah, a very, very specific set of practices and very rigorous and committed. And so it was an incredible place for me to heal and begin to bring self-awareness, awareness about my shadow, my ego, its defenses, the emotional realm. I should say that growing up, emotional mastery was the opposite in our family, very intellectualized, and I was very fearful of emotions for most of my life,
Mm.
very fearful. Which, as you know, and as I've heard you in your podcast talk about, those emotions need to come out and get processed in a healthy way, or they're going to get stuck in the body or the mind and create havoc in your life.
Yeah. And I didn't connect the dots before, but I just did it in the last 3 seconds, is that I can understand what might have hindered your feeling of emotions, because part of poker is to be able to turn that emotion off.
Oh yeah,
So the game of poker, to put a poker face, right? The literal term of it is to be emotionless because you don't want to give a tell, right?
that's
I
right.
might be using jargon that's poker
Right,
terms, good, but you get
you
it,
got it.
right? And
Oh,
and
you
so
nailed it. You nailed it.
and because that became a passion and a love, it's like it was a bit pervasive in turning emotions off all aspects of it. So it's almost like reprogramming it. So, anyways, I just
Yeah,
yeah.
you're right. So really, what Leap Forward allowed me to do, and what it's
Mm,
about, is rewiring these unconscious natural patterns that we all develop in our lives, starting in early
yeah,
childhood,
yeah,
from feeling incommensurate pain that we just cannot resolve,
yeah,
and so we build up scar tissue and defenses,
yeah,
right? And so we learn to rewire those patterns to break open the heart, break
yeah,
open the vulnerability, and ability to connect, first of all, with ourselves and our own emotions and our own purpose and passions and
yeah,
desires, right? And to see and know ourselves better, and then also to be able to connect with others. That's really what the game is about in life, isn't it?
yeah.
For
Well,
humans.
and I want to say this before we get back to the question of the means justify the ends. But before I do that, I want to give credit where credit's due because what I feel that triggered this domino effect of healing started with your wife, Laura.
Yeah.
Like what you said about bringing it back to being in a family and being like that environment and that space she helped create for you,
Yeah.
help in a beautiful way. So I haven't met Laura yet. Love to meet her one day. Like I kudos to her. So this is like a shout out for her because I really feel that when you were saying that. So
Yeah.
just wanted to acknowledge her for that, you know?
Thank you. Yeah. I'm gonna cry here a bit, and that's great. But what I'll say is you did hit the nail on the head there as well. The way I understand it and experience it, what she did, because I didn't have any history of mental illness, and this was just like a super traumatic experience for her.
Yeah.
We didn't start having kids at this point, so it would have, and we'd been married maybe 3 years by this point.
Yeah.
And so I remember her telling me that when we were back in Los Angeles in the care of my parents, and somebody said to Laura, took Laura aside, and I was in a bad shape. I was, as Laura says, like I didn't reckon he was gone. Like the Rafe I knew was gone.
Mm.
And somebody said to her, said, look, this is a lot to ask of you. Like if you were to cut bait right now and leave, like, situation, nobody could fault you. This is a lot. It's going to take a lot
Mm.
to bring him back, if he's going to be able to come back at all, because the psychiatrists were saying no.
Wow.
Psychiatrists were saying nobody ever comes back from that state. It's just a permanent state of maintenance on drugs.
Wow.
And so, to her infinite credit, she said no. She said no. This is I he's in there. I'm not abandoning him. I'm not abandoning him. And that, it's taken me a long time to actually really feel and understand that that's what was going on there. And there's been a lot of water under the bridge, and a lot of growing and learning separately and together between me and Laura. A lot, lifetimes of growth. But that core wound for me of abandonment, of feeling abandoned emotionally, and just feeling abandoned, period. And that's a core wound. And so that was like a glimpse of an experience of unconditional love and not being abandoned.
And I felt that, Rafe. And what was interesting is as I'm listening to talk about Laura, have you ever seen that movie Inside Out?
Oh yeah.
The feeling I get, that support and love. Remember that character Bing Bong?
Which one was that? Remind me.
When Joy was like stuck in the abyss and like was about to get her erased, and there was this old childhood character Bing Bong, and like they had to sing their song in order to escape the abyss to go back.
Okay. Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Anyway, it was a very emotional point in that movie, but like just hearing your story and that energy of it, man. I'm saying it just in the reference of acknowledging like I Laura did a solid in just being who she is and also showing up for you as a partner. And so I
Yeah.
felt it. I got that.
Well, I also have to acknowledge that was like this little glimpse, this one experience. Ronit and the Leap Forward community is first and foremost about unconditional love.
Beautiful.
And that was really the dojo, or the training ground, for the next decade of my life,
Yeah.
and facilitating the rest of my growing up and waking up process.
Right.
And but I do want to circle back to the ends justifying the means.
Yeah. The
Okay.
means justifying the ends. Right. Right. Or now maybe the ends justifying. Yeah.
So the expression is, or the question is, do the ends justify the means? It's
Mm.
sort of this eternal question,
Hmm.
right? And so that's the expression I'm familiar with.
Yeah.
I never heard it in the other way. Do the ends justify the means? And
Mm.
so, going back to, let's say, this first really big decision point in my career, selling the company Pick'em Sports, we interviewed maybe 5 different companies who were sniffing around to acquire Pick'em Sports. And we got offers for all stock in all of them except for one, which is the one we took.
Hmm.
We insisted on all cash, or no, so I should say a certain amount in cash, and then you can give us stock, but we wanted cash. And from our own personal perspective, that was the right move. But we overlooked this very clear reality that the person who is masterminding this roll up did not share our values and
Mm,
was the kind of person who would, like a Wall Street, Gordon Gekko type.
got it.
And this question, and I'll cut to the chase, it's like what I've learned by making the same mistake many, 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 many times, believing that the ends in certain circumstances justify the means,
Hmm.
and being able to rationalize into that proposition really well because I'm good at logic and reasoning and whatnot. That was like a core part of my worldview, my matrix, that the end could justify the means.
Hmm.
And that was a key part of the ego structure, my matrix, that needed to crumble, needed to be shattered. And the only way it was going to be shattered was if I was shattered by the experience that did happen, the psychosis, and then healing in a proper way with different values,
Hmm.
wherein the ends never justify the means.
Got it. Okay, so there's a couple of things we can go down that rabbit hole because I think part of, and this is a shout out to Tianmu because he's the one that connected us.
Yes.
For our photo audience, as you remember,
And just for spiritual lineage,
yeah,
won't name the name, but the
yeah,
person that connected me and Tian
yeah.
connected me and Ronit.
Ah, beautiful. I love that. For our audience, I invited Tian to be on our show on episode 36. He's been like a spiritual brother, and he's the one that connected me to Rafe. And so I've always been very blessed to have great people in that beautiful connection. And so where I wanted to go with this is that I feel our resonance right now, the frequency we're emitting right now, Rafe, is really knowing that, yeah, the ends don't justify the means. I think maybe because now I'm looking at my notes, why did I write the means justify the ends? It's like, oh, it's because I think we live in that paradigm now where believing is seen. So it's really, it's almost turning things upside down. We're like, oh, that's what I believe in. But like, yeah, you're right. The classic quote isn't that? It's the ends justify the means. And I look back at my life too, where yeah, there were some people in my life that lived in that framework, and I believed, well, I think that's how society works, so I need to live into that framework, but it didn't resonate with how my soul wanted to operate on, and it takes life events to happen to me to then realize, oh, okay, I gotta snap out of the blue pill in a sense, and realizing, well, it really is the reality I want to live into and want to create and want to attract. And it
Yeah.
sounds like, yeah, your life convoluted to this breaking point, this rebirth point of
Yeah.
how you want to reconstruct that. Wow. And so it leads to my next question, Rafe, which is what does the word energy mean to you?
Hmm.
And how has it, if any at all, reshaped or reshifted kind of how you operate your current reality?
Well, I'll make a distinction. There's the way that most people use energy, which is grounded in like physics, electromagnetism,
Hmm.
other forces, strong nuclear, weak nuclear, gravity, right?
Yep.
Okay. I recognize those as forms of energy. And I also recognize that there are other forms of energy that work through us, like, hey, I'm feeling like I have energy. That's a real thing,
Yeah.
right? It's important to know my level of energy, your level of energy. Energies have frequencies. So I could have high energy and have the frequency of fear. I could have low energy in the frequency of fear. I could have high energy in the frequency of joy, etc. And you could as well. And we can harmonize on those energies. I guess those would be called emotional energies.
Hmm.
Not the only type of energy that exists in a person and between people, but emotional energy is one of them.
Yeah.
People talk about chi, which is maybe different, but related perhaps. And yeah, that's a form of energy, and that's real too for me. And there are forms of energy or life force. It's hard when we go into these ethereal realms to use words, but energy is as good as any beyond the material world.
Hmm.
There's energy. There may not be matter. In fact, I've come to believe that particles and the energy that physics recognizes and time, our concept of time, these are all derivatives. Objects, thingness, these are derivatives of a deeper fundamental reality that people call spirit. They call it God. They call it oneness. They call it all sorts of things.
Hmm.
And the other, I guess, I don't want to call it a spiritual breakthrough, but it's like this worldview inversion that has happened over a long period of time for me, is going from the rationalist tradition or paradigm or worldview where life arises out of matter and energy, the particles and whatnot, versus the opposite, which is where I'm at now, which is life is primary, consciousness is primary, something
Yeah.
in that realm is
Yeah.
primary, and our material universe, all we can see, feel, touch, think about, and measure, arises from that deeper reality.
Mm.
And that's a matrix that, like, that's an even more fundamental matrix than the moral matrix of the ends not justifying the means.
Yeah. I get it because, what's interesting, Rafe, is that for me, when I look at my life experiences and my roller coaster rides and ups and downs, rather than just saying in hindsight it's 2020 and I can logically think of why one thing led to another, once I understood, hey, if our thoughts, our feelings, our actions, our models and constructs are all in the form of energy, it made me reflect back in a very different way. Because, like, just even an example I just gave earlier about when you're looking for acquirers, and first four were stock options, one was a hybrid with cash, but knowing that the values were different, when I hear that story, I can sense like, oh, yeah, energetic of what that acquirer, that aggregator was operating in and emitting was different in a different quadrant than where you want it to be. And if you're able to help yourself understand and feel that, probably would have led to different either decisions or actions you would have taken. Because for me in my life, it has. It definitely has. But it's because I have this new relationship and understanding of what energy means as it relates to money, as it relates to life, as it relates to the people that we need and who we end up, resonating with or connecting with.
Can I ask you to help me understand, like by example in your life, about that shift in understanding energy in a new way?
Yeah. So, I think one of our parallels that we have, Rafe, is the world of investing in finance, right? Ones and zeros. And there's times where before, you'll in your due diligence or in your research, you'll look at the numbers, you'll do your research, and then the facts on a call it blue pill, so to speak, matrix is pointing to one direction.
Mm-hmm.
And then your intuition might be saying something might be off. I don't know what it is yet, but something might be off. But if I don't have the actual facts to back that up, and before I didn't listen to it, right?
Mm-hmm.
The analogy I share on my show is like having a blinking light on your dashboard, and it's like, why is it blinking orange? I don't know what that means, but just ignore it, right?
Yep.
But your intuition is just trying to communicate with you of like, hey, something's off.
Yep.
But because I didn't understand energy, I ignore my intuition, and look in hindsight, it's like, oh, yep, that was a wrong decision. But then where my headspace would go to is, well, then what can I do to sharpen my sensory coming from pure logic and reason to think
Mm-hmm.
my way out of it,
Mm-hmm.
not feel my way out of it.
Right. Yes.
That's the thing. Like when you deal with facts, the common currency is IQ. How can I intelligibly think my way through it or out of it? But when I introduce the word energy, you feel energy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
as well as other senses of seeing and touch and all the other stuff, right? But when you can feel it, oh, then it's almost like having another dimension of sensing and operating and digesting that didn't exist before.
Yep.
But I wouldn't have made that jump until I felt energy. And then it made me look back. And as I'm looking back on different things, it's like, oh, I would have clearly made a different decision, but I didn't have the tools and capacity to just understand that. Does that answer your question?
Yes, and so that helps me articulate to you in your language. I know you've talked about having an internal alternator,
Yeah.
and I like your dashboard analogy. And so in my life, it was like all the instruments were so screwed up that like every single indicator, perhaps except for one, was blinking code red alert. Everybody else could see it if I let them in the cockpit, which no way they are ever getting in the cockpit.
Yeah.
But if they were to look in the windows and they could see it, it's just like going haywire. I was so far gone into my own SOS.
Yeah. That stands for subconscious operating system for the folks that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
subconscious operating
Yeah.
system, what we call it the ego structure.
Yeah.
Okay. The psyche. I was so far gone into that, yeah, you could say, yeah, feel the energy, but I couldn't because I was
Mm,
dissociated completely from the sensors.
mm,
And so for me, it took nearly a decade of intense work within, that leap forward framework before I could even begin to feel energy or feel
mm.
emotions. The thought and the feeling when I started that work.
And to add on to what you just shared, Rafe, I didn't either. I didn't understand it until I allowed permission for myself to feel. Because in some ways in my life, kind of like what poker and some life experiences train you to turn that emotion off. I shared on I think I was, I forgot which episode, but the one with intuition, episode 4, I had a traumatic experience with in middle school that made me switch that off, turn off my internal alternator. And I didn't realize how much of a detriment it was to me because I was out of mind, right? So you don't
Well, it
know.
became effective for you, right? That's the
It can't
thing,
be, yeah,
right? You went into a chosen profession and
right.
relationships in which it was effective for you. And
Yeah,
that was, that's what the human organism does. It's easy to judge ourselves and to
yeah,
judge those parts of ourselves, but they're there to protect us
right,
getting
right.
hurt again, like you did and like I did and like we all do. And so my question to you is then, what enabled you to actually let down your guard, surrender, and start to feel again after all those years of effective action and then that trauma in middle school? Because for
Yeah,
me, like near death, really.
yeah. No, that's a good question. I love how you're turning the tables. I love this. So this is bringing something fresh for our audience. So to answer your question, it took that first theta healing session with Jonathan and Bridget, which I also interviewed on the show before. They were theta healers. I didn't understand energy work at the time. I didn't know what that is. Didn't Looking back, I don't even know if I believed it at the time because I was very much into blue pill, right? In a left brain world. Jonathan Liu was in episode 8 and Bridget was episode 12. But what happened for me was I was in a session with them, and I remember very clearly the first session was with Jonathan, and as he was feeling just the situation and my aura, he just got really, really like just sad. And it's like, oh my God, I feel so much sadness. And I'm just like stone cold. I didn't feel anything. I was like, what are you talking about? And just like, I think he was able to just sense that because I've been turning off, just because you don't feel it doesn't mean it's not there.
Yeah.
And it's just maybe trapped in some one room that you've neglected in the house, but it doesn't mean it's not there.
Mhm.
I didn't realize I was doing that so effectively.
Yeah.
And him bringing that up to surface, I remember that first month, like I was a hot mess, man. I was like the emotions. I never really cried at movies, and also I'm watching some kind of commercial, and I'm just bawling. I was like, "Holy cow!" It's like opening the floodgates. I didn't know how to control it I didn't realize I didn't need to control it, but I did it because there was just so much of emotions I never allowed to process through that it was just that gushing out of, okay, I need to allow my body and my nervous system to reach that equilibrium because it needed to go through that phase. It was decades of suppressing it, but I didn't realize I was suppressing it. I was being effective.
Yeah, totally. I relate quite a bit. And so it sounds like there was this incredible like unlock that happened with, one or a handful of theta sessions that just opened the floodgates.
That's right.
And so that's interesting to like we all have a different path and journey
Yeah.
and unlock
Oh,
moves. In my case, like I'll just relate on this emotional floodgate.
yeah.
Yeah, I was a hot mess too. Once I started really doing this psycho therapeutic work, and I remember maybe 1 or 2 years in, Laura, my wife, she was not happy. I mean, I'm sure she was, you know, happy that I was getting help, but she didn't understand how deep the programming and deprogramming, unprogramming I needed, and just even the dimension of feeling, right? Because
Mm.
I've been faking feeling for myself and others for a long time.
Oh, interesting.
And so once I started doing the work, I was a mess. And like Laura turned to me one time, she's like in exasperation, it was very, very hurtful and it wasn't productive at the time, but I get it and understand. But she said something like, you used to like be somebody in the world and do, important things and make money and now all you do is sit around on Zoom and talking to bawling your eyes out with strangers. Like I hate it. Yeah. But at that point, I was starting to experience the freedom and the benefits of being more emotionally free, emotionally honest, emotionally expressive, that I couldn't go back. I couldn't put the genie back in the bottle.
Mm.
And so I was committed. Like I was all in at
Mm.
that point in continuing to work on myself and to open myself and peel back the scar tissue and peel back the layers of defenses.
Yeah. So, Rafe, my intuition is telling me to go to ask this question because I think this is a really interesting, we both experience this in our own respective lives, in that allowing emotions to feel, to give yourself the space of allowing emotions to feel can sometimes feel like it's a tidal wave. It could be a big gush, right? And it can or cannot be easy or hard. And so my question to you is, what advice would you give our audience where maybe they know, okay, they've been quote unquote effective in not feeling, but now they realize that, okay, I might have hit this roadblock and I want to start feeling now. What's a gentler way of taking that first step?
Yeah. What's coming up is there are literally millions of therapists offline and online 24/7 that can provide emotional support and create a safe space for you to explore the territory. And if you're new to that, it doesn't really like as you progress and you learn more about your own defenses and you really need to crack things open, but just like getting things flowing, it doesn't even have to be a professional. It could be someone you really, trust. It could be somebody anonymous if you feel safer, but just practicing sharing completely honestly what you're feeling without having to understand or organize or make the stories true or false
Yeah.
come up. Just being able to do that is incredible. I think an incredible way to start. And then also meditation.
Mm.
And so, I mean, I'll just share that a year ago, Laura and I started seeing a mindfulness coach, couples coach. And the first thing that she said is, look, we can talk all day long very frequently. And what I recommend, though, is start meditating a half hour each day at the beginning of the day, not 20 minutes, not 25 minutes, but a half hour, and be consistent. And there's no wrong way to do it. You're just practicing, you're getting your body used to this idea of being in stillness and awareness of awareness. And you're training your body for not the times that you're meditating, but just all these other times when you're triggered. And she said, trust me, I've done it every which way. I did 15 years of 20 minutes a day and no transformation. Once I hit that 30-minute threshold and did it consistently, I started to really wake up and I started
Mm.
to be able to do the work, the psycho-emotional work effectively.
Yeah.
So yeah, start sharing emotions in a safe, non-judgmental way container, and then have some sort of mindfulness practice. And if it's not meditation, other people have different ways, but the stiller you are, the more potent it is.
I love it. It's also why a lot of times my action steps is the Cal method, and the first step is calming yourself, right? Whatever way that works for you. So we're in sync there, man. Okay, so I am being mindful of time and wrapping up, Rafe. The second to last question is this. If time machine was real, the DeLorean was real, and you can jump in that car and you can go back and travel in time, what year would you travel back to, and what would be one advice you would share to your younger self?
So I know this is a thought experiment because you can't just go back and give yourself the wisdom that you need to learn
Mm,
through the ups and downs and the crises. The crises really are the doorways.
yeah,
But if I could somehow magically pour this wisdom or this worldview into my head as a younger self,
yeah.
it would be those two things that I mentioned, which is you are a spiritual being having a human experience, and the ends never justify the means.
Oof. I felt those two messages. I'm curious though, how old are you where you feel those two messages would have the most impact for you?
Well, first of all, I want to say that just thinking about this question and my answer now, like I'm realizing that as children, we're born with this knowledge
Mm.
and it gets inverted by enculturation. And okay. So, where would that have been the most powerful? It would have been most powerful when I started my career, when
Mm.
I left university.
The early 20s.
Yeah. Mhm.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Okay. And last but not least, Rafe, where can our listeners find you?
Just my personal website, rafefurst.com, RAF as in Frank, EFURST.com.
Beautiful. And I will include your website on the show notes so people can have access to that. Any last parting words or comments you'd like to share with the audience before we wrap up?
Well, I don't know about the audience, but Ben, this has been such a delight. I just so thoroughly appreciate it and have enjoyed, but also like felt you deeply and felt myself deeply in the process. And that's a gift. And man, uh, I guess for the audience, if you ever have an opportunity to go on Ben's show, do it.
I don't think I've had any other guest say that. Thank you, Rafe. That I felt that, man. I appreciate that. I appreciate it. And I appreciate not only for Tian connecting us, but the abundance of possibilities we're going to get to experience and co-create. And so I want to say first, Rafe, thank you so much for coming here today and sharing your life, your wisdom, your joy. I felt all of it. And I'm confident that our audience felt that too. And so thank you for being so just real and raw in giving that.
You're quite welcome. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to do so.
Beautiful. Thanks, Rafe. Folks, I hope you all enjoyed today's interview with Rafe. There are so many stories and rabbit holes that Rafe shared with us today. And I love the two things what he said at the end, which is you are a spiritual being having a human experience. The second thing that he shared is that the ends never justify the means. If there's a quote I can share that captures some of the feelings I felt from today's interview, it is this. All the darkness in the world cannot extinguish the light of a single candle. This quote was by St. Francis of Assisi. Folks, if you're going through a rough patch or feeling moments of uncertainty or moments of darkness, know that there's light within you. I hope by hearing Rafe's story that this inspires you to allow some air, some space for yourself to allow your light to breathe, to glow and shine. You've got this. If you enjoyed today's interview, I encourage you to go to Apple Podcasts and review and rate this podcast so that others can find this show. If you haven't already, I invite you to hit that subscribe button to this Boom Vision podcast if you are hungry to grow mentally, physically, and spiritually. Until next time, folks, be kind to yourself. Be in the light. Be you. Thank you so much for tuning in to my Boom Vision podcast. If you'd like to find out more about me and this podcast, head over to benjaminyeh.com. That's spelled BenjaminYeh.com. If you haven't already, click subscribe, and I'll catch you next time.